so much, and what a wonderful introduction from two women that I've admired so much over the years, and it was fantastic. We were just in the green room earlier on, reminiscing about the golden age. Was there ever one? I'm not sure. But anyway, look, I know for you, Kate, it's a day of firsts. It's also a day of firsts for me too. This is my first public lecture as the chair of the Victorian Multicultural Commission, and strangely enough, there's a synergy for me with the library, because one of the reasons I decided to leave my career at Channel 7 last year was really came after a weekend here at the library when I was researching a story that I was doing at the time on medical marijuana. And I was in the library and contemplating where the story might go, and I was getting frustrated that we weren't approaching the story in a I guess, broader context in the way that I wanted to see it manifested. And it was really here that I made the decision to leave media and pursue something else, documentaries at the time. And as it turns out, it's led me to this path, to the Multicultural Commission. So, and also I'd like to mention something that you've also touched on. It's just a wonderful place to visit. I bring interstate visitors all the time, or overseas visitors, and I'm hoping that I can secure a behind-the-scenes tour with you as well. And Jill, of course, we've got great synergy. I mean, I only did a year at Today Tonight, but I thought of you quite a lot in that year. And sister, I've got all the admiration for you in the world for surviving that. You are, really one of my heroes. So, look, thank you very much to all of you for being here on a Monday evening as well. And I know this evening there is a lot happening around town. We'll discuss some of the events that are occurring this evening a bit later. But this talk really, I guess, is quite prescient for us at the moment, given the weekend events. And it's a critical one for our sector at the Victorian Multicultural Commission and related agencies, because once again, our social cohesion is under threat. And I guess, of course, I am referring to the weekend events, which have been in themselves difficult to absorb. And in the context, I guess, of governments telling us that they're doing everything that they can to secure security in this time, if you like, and us sitting with that and being comfortable with that until something like this happens again. And then what it tells us more immediately is that there is a long way to go, and there's a long-term strategy that has to be implemented. So I think it's a really interesting time to be at the Commission because we are involved in policy. And there's a lot of my colleagues tonight. Maybe most of you are my colleagues, I'm not quite sure. But thank you very much for attending. Srini, one of our commissioners, is here, and Marion Lau, thank you very much for being here, and Bruce Pope from OMAC, and I'll explain all the acronyms later. I've discovered that with the public service, you have to learn a lot of acronyms. Sometimes there's the same acronym as well. So if I can really learn all those acronyms after the 4 years, I think I'll have achieved something just in that regard alone. A little bit about me first. This talk, as you can see, is about something. We hear a lot of vernacular within the Commission and within public policy speak, but you don't often hear language that you can relate to. So instead of social cohesion, I really chose to emphasise the right to belong, which is something that for me is a fundamental aspect of how we should view our community going forward. So as Jill touched on, before I joined and Kate as well, before I joined the Victorian Multicultural Commission, I did have a long career in the media. I worked for the 3 commercial broadcasters and the 2 public broadcasters, and more recently as a filmmaker. So I did a documentary on medical marijuana, which is due to be released soon. And then I was going to go off studying when I was doing an MC gig on one night on cultural diversity, and I decided to get up and speak a little bit more liberally about, I guess, the difficulty in reconciling my identity as a Greek Australian. And the Premier and the Multicultural Minister heard that, and so we started the conversation, and that's what led me here. But being a Greek Australian and being a media representative, I guess that's coloured my lens by both of those experiences, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's start off at the beginning. That's me in the middle there, and that is my mum at the top on the Patrice, and that's my dad on the left. They arrived here about 50 years ago, and back then it was a month-long journey to get here. So yes, I was the child of immigrants, and that did colour my perceptions of the world. once upon a time it wasn't such a cool thing to be Greek, but we'll talk about that later. So that's a brief snapshot of my upbringing. And I guess the weekend events really reminded me of two things that I've often encountered on big stories that I did over the years. So it took me back to journalism, and especially stories that involved mass tragedy and devastation. The first thing really for me was the triumph of humanity that you see. It's a common thing that you see at the end of one of these stories or in the process, but mostly, obviously, immediately after the event has occurred, and the collective goodwill that we often see as a result. So over the weekend, we saw an incredible display of goodwill. We saw, obviously, these outward displays, and tonight, I think, I wish I could be in two places at once. The peace rally's been being held down at Federation Square, obviously to unite the community. So these, I guess, are wonderful displays of goodwill that occur, and displays of solidarity that go a long way to restoring our collective sense as an identity, within the community. So the second thing, I guess, that I pondered over the weekend, in light of my journalism background, was the tone of the reporting. Although it seemed to come across as fairly well-informed on the essential facts, to me it lacked a narrative that didn't go far enough in distinguishing the acts of terrorism from being linked entirely to religion. What occurred, of course, was outside of religion. It's also irresponsible to just blame the refugee crisis, which unfortunately is what we're seeing at the moment, and to oversimplify the issues of border control. Unfortunately, it followed a series of terrorist attacks across the globe in recent weeks, some of which we really didn't hear much about at all, including those in Beirut, some in West Africa, and one we did hear about, the Russian airliner which crashed in Egypt. And one of my frustrations as a reporter over the years was that often a more thoughtful and considered narrative was missing from the stories that needed it the most, stories like this. But that's a conversation for another time, and maybe in about half an hour's time with Jill, because we've touched on it already. So yeah, and there's a few things I'd like to add to that. Instead, the conversations I'd like to draw you to more immediately are those conversations which took place over the weekend between the VMC and our related agencies and our community leaders, our respective community leaders representing both the Islamic and Jewish communities in particular. Our Muslim leaders, in particular, feared that our community would be wrongly identified as having some place in the value system of terrorists, which is often, unfortunately, how this is purported, that the actions of a few would be wrongly reflected as belonging to a community who peacefully practice the same faith. For example, the claims that terrorism acts are carried out only by Sunni Muslims is using sectarian language and untruthful dialogue to divide, even within the Muslim community itself. This is a time, of course, when that community needs to be more united than ever. They all stress to us that once again, the Muslim community is in for some tough times ahead. There's no doubt that an act of terrorism is a fearful act. It threatens our sense of security, but for our Muslim community, it also threatens their right, their equal right to religious diversity and their right to belong. And this is why I talk on social cohesion and how we can all play a role in strengthening it is an imperative conversation to have at this time. So exactly what is social cohesion? Well, broadly defined, it's the willingness of members of society to cooperate with each other in order to survive and prosper, which is why we work so closely with our newly established Social Cohesion and Resilience Unit in the Victorian Government to look at issues which disrupt social cohesion in Victoria. In fact, $25 million has been dedicated to it. And importantly, intervention and prevention strategies around these issues. But first, let me give you some background on what we actually do at the VMC. It's really funny when you start a new role, everyone says, so, what's the VMC? That's the first question. The second one is, what do you do? So I'll answer that for you right now. Okay, so the VMC, we are not government. That's the first thing to tell you. We are a commission. We're an independent statutory authority. We are the voice, and here go the acronyms, of the called communities. That means cultural and linguistically diverse communities. We help empower communities with either funding through grants or strategic leadership, covering everything from language classes to refugee resettlement and, of course, multicultural festivals and everything in between. As you can see, these are the countries that we represent, 260 languages and dialects and 135 faiths. That's just in Melbourne, which makes us the most culturally diverse state in the entire country. Our broader initiatives involve research, which will become a more heavy focus for us now, informing government policy and strengthening our community engagement. We have 12 commissioners, a deputy, I think that includes the deputy and the chair, which is me, of course, a youth commissioner and a community representative commissioner who's nominated by the Ethnic Community Council of Victoria, also known as the ECCV. One more acronym. We have 8 RACs. They are Regional Advisory Councils, 5 regional and 3 metro. So, understandably, much of our preoccupation at this time is focused on engaging our youth and accurately capturing their voices and trying to understand how we can help them actualise the seed of their potential at a time when the future seems uncertain. In this age of individualism, where is our community positioned? And are our youth feeling the same sense of belonging that each generation did before? And that is, before the advance of technology. Or are they feeling socially isolated? Tonight's lecture will draw from many sources and some of the thinking around this space, which is not the conventional thinking around this space either. It may well raise more questions than answers, but we do feel, of course, that it is an important conversation to be having at this time. So we've got a little bit of a glossary coming up, not much, just a couple of explanations. The first one, of course, being individualism, which is I guess the meaning or the term itself has a lot of academic manifestations, and this definition is a pretty straightforward one. Put simply, the habit or principle of being independent or self-reliant, a social theory favouring freedom of action for individuals over collective or state control. Anthropologist Margaret Mead defined it as a behaviour in which the individual strives towards a goal without reference to others. She was all about reminding us how unique the individual is and how without democracy there can be no individualism because they're paired together. So individualism within a democracy usually involves obviously living and coexisting within a competitive state whose primary goals are often centred on material acquisition and corporate success. But it depends on which cultural setting you apply it to. Scandinavians, for example, are extremely individualistic and extremely non-competitive. The next term is fundamentalism, a term which doesn't have many positive connotations at all and is largely linked to the thinking around radicalised youth and the emergence of the far right. It's defined as a form of religion, especially Islam and Protestant Christianity, that upholds belief in the strict, literal interpretation of Scripture. For some, that could mean the strict preservation of cultural beliefs. For others, it's a vexed and negative term. You cannot, for example, be a fundamentalist and have a pluralistic view of the world. And pluralism is a system in which 2 or more states of groups coexist, where numerous distinct ethnic, religious or cultural groups are present and tolerated within a society. The term itself is viewed by many global theorists as a limited one because within it we don't critically reflect on our own culture. It doesn't go to the next level. The author of The Dignity of Difference, How to Avoid the Clash of Civilizations, Jonathan Sachs, says we now live in the conscious presence of difference. In the street, at work, in the media, we constantly encounter cultures whose ideas and ideals are unlike ours. That in itself can be a profound threat to our identity. He says one of the biggest transformations has taken place between the 20th and 21st century, when once we were dominated by the politics of ideology. What's taking place now is the politics of identity. Religion, he says, has emerged to become a powerful presence on the world stage because religion is one of the great answers to the question of identity. But identity divides. It creates an us and it creates a them, the people not like us. In the very process of creating a community within their borders, religion can create conflict across their borders. He says, the test of faith is whether I can make space for that difference. Can I recognise God's image in someone who is not in my image, whose language, faith, ideals are different from mine? If I cannot, then I have made God in my image instead of allowing him to remake me in his. So, how do individualism and fundamentalism present themselves in a modern world, and especially among our youth? In the Western world, of course, the most obvious example of individualism has occurred through the march of technology, adapted first and most enthusiastically by our youth. And of course, this is what's fueling this new age of individualism. So is it a bad thing? Well, no, not necessarily, especially when it works for a high cause. In many ways, it's been a very positive development for society because it allows freedom of expression. It empowers youth to make decisions based on readily accessible information and research, and it opens them up to interact and engage with a wider community, with a global community. And I think maybe an extension of that is adopting a more global mindset. Within that global outlook are several cultural repertoires, like the social media community, the transnational community, and so on it goes. So youth are now cultivating their identity from multiple platforms and an identity, and I guess forming an identity, as a truly global citizen. This generation, more than anyone that preceded it. The potential in that for the rest of us is that they ultimately develop a mindset that means we're not just caring for our local citizens, but for our fellow human beings. That's the value of these social networks. And that leads me to the next level of that social network. If there is one theme that underscores a lot of the work that we do at the VMC and that correctly positions the term multiculturalism, it's the right to belong in a community as an individual, to be proud of your religious and cultural diversity and to feel safe in it. Peter Block, who wrote Community and the Structure of Belonging, explores the fragmented community and how to achieve transformation within it. We've found a lot of synergy in this book at the VMC with what our communities actually tell us, especially the observation that each community is working hard on its own purpose, but that parallel effort will not make a community. So last year we conducted 10 multicultural forums for 180 people between the ages of 16 and 25. They came from very diverse backgrounds, including second and third generation migrants, recent migrants, and humanitarian refugees. The overarching theme was strengthening social cohesion, engaging our youth and our future. It turned out that developing identity was a strong theme raised at every single forum and related directly to our youth seeking a place of acceptance. They told us that continuous negative stereotyping impacts negatively upon diverse communities and makes them feel that they don't belong. That media should not mix up terrorists with normal citizens such as them. They also suggested a solution in the form of intercultural understanding, challenging society to promote a better understanding of our cultures. So back to Peter Block, who says this dividedness is what makes it so difficult to create a more positive or alternative future, especially when that culture is more interested in individuality and independence than in interdependence. Our biggest work, as he sees it, is to overcome that fragmentation. So how do we go about creating that alternative future? Small groups, of course, one gathering at a time, but where each gathering becomes an example of the future that we want to create. So it's the small group where that transformation takes place. Large-scale transformation can take place when enough small shifts lead to that larger change. Small groups have the most leverage, according to his research, when they meet as part of a larger gathering. So communal possibility and transformation only occur through a small gathering. And I guess to summarise his work, the power of a small group cannot be overemphasised. It allows every single voice to be heard. Evidence shows that it is groups of 3 to 12 where intimacy is created. This intimate conversation makes the process personal and, of course, perhaps creates a more truthful dialogue. And importantly, provides a structure where the experience of belonging is created. There is, I think, immense value in knowing that we're part of something that's so much bigger, that we think, worry and feel the same way, not just within our own communities, but in those further afield. The universal thread being that we want an equal place in the community to be heard, no matter where we are. The Victorian Government's Social Cohesion and Resilience Unit, which I've referred to, says the research that they've conducted says that radicalisation of youth is not a problem of whole communities in our society, but of a small number of individuals and their social networks. And there is no single pathway for those drawn to violent extremism. And while we know that a resilient community is also a connected community, perhaps it is our youth who hold the key to that communal transformation, where the need to understand each other is paramount. It's at this point that the individual realises that he's part of a larger cause, or that he or she is part of a larger cause. And our challenge, really, as a community, is to make sure that it's a cause with humanitarian outcomes, one that will benefit all of humanity. Most of us, it's true, will find at least a cause to champion in our lifetime, and more often than not, it's a higher cause than ourselves. So we go from I to we, and we look at what can be created together. Because in understanding ourselves, we reinforce our own identity. And within the context of a community, it's where the real sense of belonging can be achieved. The most cohesive societies and communities are those which secure every member's right to belong. When we work best together, that's what's known as social capital, and that's how we really do measure the health of a community. And social capital refers to the collective value of all social networks. Okay, no? Maybe not yet. Okay. It refers to the value of all social networks and the inclinations that arise from these networks to do things for each other. And you've probably guessed which community this is going to be, but there is one Australian community that doesn't follow the ideology of individualism, but whose social cohesion, interestingly, is arguably the most intact of all of our communities, and that is our Indigenous community. Australia's Indigenous community has a very specific relationship of ownership and custodianship to land and country that has no equivalent among any immigrant community. It is a spiritual, physical, social and cultural connection. Aboriginal lawyer, Australian Aboriginal lawyer and prominent academic Noel Pearson says that Aboriginal individualism is actually at odds with the Aboriginal community. The latter, he says, is constraining the former. He argues that an aura of ethical or cultural illegitimacy attaches itself to Indigenous people who pursue enterprise and wealth. That is the domain of Western ideals on which the Indigenous population have not sought to adopt as a community. And that really feeds directly into the work of Margaret Mead, and whose work was referenced directly after the 9/11 attacks. Studying the psychology of an individual in culture, she made the point that culture determined an individual's personality far more than people had previously expected, and that we had to be careful that we didn't outgrow individualism to become isolationist or socially isolated. Basically, she steered us towards an important conclusion that by cherishing the cultural diversity of the world, that we cherish our own. And within that diversity lay the hope for human survival. Because, of course, we all have the right to be here together. And I guess at that point I'd like to just refer briefly to my own experience. And there was a time growing up when I was really ashamed to own my own identity, and I didn't want to identify as a Greek Australian. As a teenager, as we know, it's a difficult enough time as it is, but being the only Greek at a Catholic school along with my siblings made that journey a fairly painful one. And I remember one of the more painful experiences of that time was being spat on in my local neighbourhood, just a few hundred metres from my home, I remember the first time I was called a wog and how ashamed I felt to be called a wog, and how ashamed I was to own my own heritage. Which is why I will always feel a profound empathy for those experiencing racism. I guess I've come to regard it as a cyclical phenomenon over the years. Someone's always in the firing line. The VMC has certainly been on that journey with many of our communities who've triumphed and succeeded by staying resilient together. Despite our differences in Australia, the research, though, tells us that Australians are very accepting of cultural diversity. In a recently released Scanlon survey, the only longitudinal study of its kind in Australia, which means it was conducted over a series of years, I think this is the 8th year that's been conducted, and it's quite empirically based, which means that they've asked the same questions to the same groups of communities over the years, which makes it a very sound research model to draw conclusions from. It actually concluded that it was the young Australians who favoured the provision of government assistance to ethnic minorities to maintain their customs and traditions. And that was just such an interesting finding, because 65% of young people were in support of that, compared to just 34% of middle-aged respondents. So that really tells us that it's our youth that are more accepting of our increasingly diverse community, and that perhaps they can help guide us towards a more inclusive society. But of course, we have a lot of work to do. Most of you are probably aware of the incident which took place at an Apple store in High Point last week. In brief, I'll just summarise it. Basically what occurred was that there was 5 African teenage boys that were kicked out of the store because of fears that they would shoplift.
There's no reason for this. These guys
Here it is.
are just a bit worried about your presence in our store.
Yeah.
They're just worried you might steal something.
Why would we steal something?
It's okay.
Why would we steal something?
Why do we have security? Guys, end of discussion. Yeah. I need to ask you to leave our store.
So I'm not sure what the audio was like, but for us really this, and for the community at large, this really was a clear example of racial profiling. And as one of my colleagues pointed out to me yesterday, when you type in Apple Australia into Google, the second search option is Apple Australia racism. As a result of this, Apple CEO Tim Cook has ordered retraining for staff worldwide as a consequence. Probably didn't help that they got millions of views on social media either. He is committing to the fact that his staff worldwide will be retrained in inclusion and customer engagement. For us, I guess it represents an opportunity to open up the multicultural dialogue once again among our youth networks, and in the coming days we're also due to have that same discussion with Apple about exactly that. So as you can see, youth engagement will become one of the most important areas for us moving forward at the VMC, because we realise that it's not our youth that are the problem, but rather they present the solution, where incremental change could in fact lead to wholesale change. And I'll leave the final word to the great Margaret Mead, who pioneered this way of thinking about cultures at a time when nobody else was. Never doubt that a small group of concerned citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Thank you.